record now. You shouldn't come up if you want to be anonymous. You can ask questions anonymously and keep quiet in the background, and you won't come up on the recording if you don't feel comfortable with that. Other things, I think that's pretty much everything to let you know. Actually, I'll hand it straight over to Lukash to do the presentation.
Hi everyone. So we've got about hour and a half together today to kind of deal with some very poignant questions in regards to relationship and sex education, and I'll be covering gender and sexuality as well, just to kind of give us some foundation, because I don't know where people are at the moment. And I think it gives us a good understanding of where we are at, and then kind of build from there. So hopefully this is going to be a good grounding for all of us. So so let's begin. I feel that's kind of the best way to learn, is through kind of trying and seeing how things work. So let me just start the presentation for you, just 2 seconds. So I can share with you my screen. Here we are. So we'll be talking about sexuality, gender, and relationships education for guardians, which includes everyone who is looking after children and young people. And I'm the executive director at Mosaic LGBT+ Young Persons Trust. And you might ask yourself, what are my credentials? And you're righteous at asking that question. I am, well, I've been working with young persons for a very long time. I started my career working with young persons 15 years ago. And throughout that time, we have done easily hundreds of different workshops on sex education and health and sexual health and consent, and you name it, it's out there. So we have done all of that work because we believe very strongly that young persons need to have those conversations and have spaces where they can have those conversations safely. If they don't have space to have those conversations safely, then what does happen is they tend to look for information online, and they start to get lost in what their peers are telling them, which is not always adequate information, not always safe information, not always information that comes from the right place. So sometimes it's about coercing them into doing things that we would not want them to be coerced into doing. So the best things to do is to kind of prevent it with some ground rules and understanding kind of where sexuality, gender, and kind of relationship education and sex education kind of fits in, and what's appropriate at what age. I think a lot of the time of the parents in my experience kind of get bogged down with like, oh, what do I tell at what stage? So we'll cover that as well, which you'll be happy to hear. So so a few things. I have set on some aims and objectives for us today. So aims and objectives of the session will be to be able to understand functional basics of sexuality and gender identity, which kind of give us some ground rules, where some kind of grounding from where we are going to start. Then we'll start understanding kind of relationship patterns and sex education appropriateness. And then we'll look at creating kind of safer space for young persons to explore relationships and sex. You'll notice that we use a bit of a different language than any other organization, perhaps, that you might have spoken to before. We say young persons, we say young person because we are very kind of individual young person focused, because we believe that a tailored support to young persons accordingly to their needs is what is needed. So we don't use kind of anonymized language like youth or young people. But that's just us. It's something that we do at Mosaic. So you might use a different language, but we say young person at Mosaic. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to start with a learning pyramid. I think it's always very useful for us to realize where we are at in our learning journey. I'm using this for 2 reasons. One, to kind of make us aware of where we are at, and also how it feels to be in those different spheres. So I think first thing first is kind of, we need to realize that there's some level of unconscious incompetence. So we don't know what we don't know, right? So there's some areas of knowledge, and sometimes the young person would approach me and would ask me a question using the language that I don't understand. And up until this point, I didn't know what they were talking about, right? So now I know because they have asked that question. So what I can do is to kind of realize that this is my area for development. So I'm now entering the sphere of conscious incompetence. So I'm aware that there was something that that is missing in this equation and that I might do something about. When I decide to learn about it, then I'm going to develop my understanding of the matter. And then what happens is you're entering the sphere of conscious competence. And that's very important because basically a lot of the times parents are in that sphere of kind of conscious competence, because basically what happens is when we are in conscious competence, it means that you have to focus on what you're saying and how we are saying things in order for this to make sense, right? So I don't know if you think about the time when you kind of first started work or when you first started driving, that's the time when you kind of like really have to think about what you are saying or what we are doing, how you're acting, how you're being perceived, you know, when you started driving, you know, how kind of this gear works, and you kind of have to do everything manually. It's almost like you're focusing on it. After you've done it for several years, people do go on and drive and are able to hold conversations at the same time, not when you're starting to learn, because you need to focus. So after you've done driving for several years and you know what you're talking about, and me, I have worked with teenagers for 15 years, it kind of becomes kind of like a second nature. So it becomes this unconscious competence, and every time I train staff or I have new members of my team joining me at the organization, like I kind of realize they're very conscious of like, oh, am I allowed to say this? Am I not allowed to say this? And I know what I'm allowed to say because I've been doing this job for a very long time. So, but even though some stuff can be in this unconscious competence, we still have to kind of go down to conscious competence through continuous professional development, through learning, through supervision, through sessions like these ones, right? So I think it is quite important that we realize that we are never actually out of that kind of learning loop. And I'm saying this for another reason as well. I want you all to kind of be aware that when you start learning about sexual health, and when you start learning about sex, when you start learning about relationships, and you start thinking about talking to your children about this, or children that you might be working with or looking after, what is going to happen is when it's the first time you're doing it, you're going to feel a bit awkward about it. And that's conscious competence, and that's okay. And give yourself permission to feel that, and give yourself permission to be in that sphere. That's a stretch zone. This is where we are learning, and this is where we're expanding. And if we are going to wait until we are perfect in everything, we're never going to do anything. So something's about starting the conversation, and starting small is the tip of the day, but we'll cover some of it later on. So the methodology that we use at Mosaic that I think is quite important and poignant, and I've said it several times in different training sessions, we use the PERMA methodology, which is positive emotion, engagement, positive relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. And if you think about sex, relationship education, or relationship and sex education as it is now in first, because we're trying to focus more on relationships and not as much on sex, but sex, of course, as well, because I think there's something really important that young persons sometimes missing in understanding relationships when we just talk about sex. So I think there's something really important because it creates a sense of well-being, and I think we are sometimes underestimating the importance of young persons need to feel well, need to have positive self-esteem in order to assert themselves in relationship with others, in relationship with their peers, relationship that might be intimate. Because I have witnessed over my career several examples of young persons who knew exactly what to say, who knew exactly how to behave, but they haven't. And the one thing that was a common thread across of it was the fact that those young persons have had very low self-esteem, they felt rejected, and they would ask questions like, but what if they didn't like me anymore, right? So things that are putting them at kind of very vulnerable spot. So what is happening as a process is that it is quite important that we create an environment in which the young person can feel well about themselves. And when they do, then they will be more able to assert themselves in a world around them. And according to the theory, which originates from positive psychology, it is quite important to have positive emotions and recognize, although there's a lot to be said about having the memories, having the positive experiences, feeling engaged and feeling like they're connecting. And I think that can be at school, it can be at home, but it's having that kind of level of engagement and being treated with certain level of responsibility and regard, I think is quite critical for young persons. Having positive relationships, and it can be with adults, but also with peers. And I think sometimes that's forgotten in all of those conversations. It's giving young persons understanding and meaning, so contextualizing things. And I think a lot of the times when we work with young persons, what happens is we work on kind of models that sometimes oversimplify things, but I think, let's be honest, I think we are not able to always hold an Oxford dictionary in our minds. So giving young persons some point of reference is quite useful. So we use this, a meaning theory, which is quite useful. One tip that I can give you that works really, really well with my young persons is that when we want to have conversations about stuff that's quite difficult, like substance misuse, like sex and relationships, as well as what else? Oh my God, anything really. And it is quite difficult for the young person to engage on a personal level because they're like, oh, that's not my problem, I'm not having this problem, right? That's kind of like the common response, especially in kind of teenage years. Like, oh, I already know everything, like it's okay. What happens is the young person feels disengaged from that conversation because they feel like it doesn't apply to them yet, right? The problem is that if they don't acquire that knowledge quite early, what's going to happen is they will not be able to Google it on the spot. That's pretty much the problem, right? So when we kind of approach that conversation, it is quite important that young persons have got some level of meaningful, contextualized kind of understanding. So the way that we kind of bypass this is like, is when the young person says or responds to us saying, oh, well, it doesn't apply to me, or like, I don't have to worry about it. We're like, yes, we know, but it might be useful for you to know because one of your friends might be in such a situation, right? I love the fact that what we're doing two things at the same time. They are acquiring the knowledge because now they're interested because everyone wants to be a good friend. And B, they're kind of learning what it means to be a responsible friend and how does responsible friend behave. I don't know if you've seen the most recent mayor's campaign against the harassment of women. And it's quite interesting how it is structured because it's not structured on women anymore, as campaigns have often been. It is now centered around men. And they say, if you do see behavior like this, have a word with yourself, right? Which is quite interesting. It's kind of focused on this mindset of a man in such situation. It gives people meaning. It's that element that's missing. And it's kind of empowering people to be the standing agents, especially when we are kind of the bystanders, so the people who are the third party in such situation. Because in any of that situation, we can approach it from the victim's perspective, the perpetrator's perspective, or the bystander perspective. Right? So kind of that kind of looks at the bystander perspective, which is very interesting and again kind of offers people that level of meaning. And then we look at accomplishments, and I think accomplishments kind of feed into self-esteem. They feed into ability to say no when we don't feel like doing something, and kind of feeling validated and feeling like you can do things that are in line with your own values. And I think that's quite important because it gives people some level of understanding of self and how they kind of fit into the broader world. So I think it does translate a lot into what we'll be talking about, but let me move on for now. So let's begin at the beginning. Sex and gender, those are the main terms that are very often being used interchangeably. And I'm going to begin here because it's a very good place to start at the very beginning, as the song goes. So sex is something that we are all born with. We have biological sex, that's what it is. And then obviously we do engage ourselves in sexual intercourse. However, what is quite important for us to recognize is that there's also another term that's very often being misunderstood, which is gender. Those terms are used interchangeably, but they are not interchangeable because they describe completely different things. Sex is biological, so that's why it's on a birth certificate. If you've ever seen a birth certificate, which I'm sure you have, then what is going to happen is you're going to see that the word sex is on a birth certificate, the gender is not, because gender is not observed at the time of birth, but sex is. So sex is basically what our bodies look like. Children can be born into 3 different types of sexes. So it can be male, female, or intersex. So the signs of both genitals. In UK, it is not possible to put intersex on the birth certificate because it's illegal. It is legal in Iceland, in Australia, and in Germany at the moment. In UK, it's not. So parents normally would choose what goes on a birth certificate at this stage. So sex is very biological, right? So we know it's kind of something that we can see visually. Gender is psychological, so that's how people feel about themselves. So it develops further down the road, and children kind of develop understanding of gender as they grow, and they start kind of seeing how they fit within the wider world. Then we have sexuality, so kind of how the sexuality kind of fits into all of this. It kind of sits slightly aside, because we know that sexuality has sexual orientation, so whom people are attracted to. So can be attracted to same sex, they can be attracted to opposite sex, or they can be attracted to both sexes or more than two. We'll be covering it in a minute. So sexual orientation is who people are attracted to. Behavior is what people do with that sexual orientation. So there are some people who do not have or do not engage in sexual behavior at all whatsoever. It is because they might be asexual, so they don't have sexual desires. It might be because they're cultural or religious reasons. So they might not believe in sex before marriage, for instance. So it doesn't mean that sexual orientation doesn't exist, because they'll still have sexual orientation. They just choose not to practice that sexual orientation for religious or cultural reasons, as mentioned. And then there's an element of identity. So that triangulation of sexuality, the identity formulates, especially amongst minoritized groups. So lesbian, gay, bisexual people, they kind of formulate identity around kind of forms of oppression, because a lot of the identity is formulated as a response to oppression. So let's talk about it in a kind of gender-bread format, because we do believe that it kind of allows us to have a better understanding of how those things fit together. And then I'll move on into sex education and relationship education. So a few things. We were talking about gender identity. So gender identity is how people feel about themselves. And we know people feel about themselves as men or as women, or genderqueer is people who don't kind of see themselves as fitting neither men nor women. We know that biological sex, we have male, female, and intersex. So intersex is a person with any variation of chromosomes that isn't typically male or female. And here's something interesting that is worth noting, that biological sex uses different language than gender. So gender uses language like man, woman, boy, girl. The biological sex, so the biological science uses male and female. What has happened, however, in recent years is that a lot of this language is being used across gender, because it doesn't carry the luggage or the ballast of cultural norms. So things like man up and don't be a girl, or boys don't cry, all that stuff that's gender kind of related. When people say, oh, I'm a male, I'm a female, doesn't carry that weight. So a lot of that language has recently, within the last several years, have cross-transferred into the world of gender. So gender-wise, we know that gender and people who are transgender have been present in history for a very long time. This is Chevalier Dion, who has been the 18th century spy from France into the Russian court, and is considered to be a very first person who has legally transitioned, so changed their gender on paperwork from male to female, and functioned as a female for the duration of the retirement time of their life. So I think it's quite important to recognize that it's not new. The transitioning is not new. The people who are transgender, people who feel differently, so their gender is different than their biological sex. So we know that people have that experience, and those are the people who we would refer to as transgender. Also, we know about Eddie Izzard, who recently came out. She has come out to us a couple of times, but I think most recently very loudly and kind of proudly. So I think it is quite important for us to realize that sometimes how people present is different to how they identify. It is not also a European phenomena. So people who we would refer to as transgender have been part of kind of broader society for a very long time. And globally, there are different examples of people who are non-conforming with this kind of binary man and a woman kind of ideas. So in India, kind of Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, there's parts of Afghanistan, not all of Afghanistan. There's a third gender, which you would refer to as third gender, which is referred to as Hijra locally. And it's quite a difficult concept for us to understand because we don't have that construct yet in our Western understanding. And we don't have that construct simply because a lot of the stuff then that we understand about gender kind of originates from biology. So a lot of the stuff comes from the fact that, you know, how can you have a third gender when you only have a penis and a vagina? So I think it is quite difficult for people to kind of see that there can be a third construct of gender. It is even more difficult when people start realizing that in some tribes across North America before the colonial times, they recognize up to 5 different types of gender. So they have functional constructs of 5 different genders. So gender is something that is socially constructed. We agree in what it is, and it's different in different societies. We can see on those examples. So I think that's something to keep in mind, especially that very often we're being told that it's just a fad and it's something new that has just developed, which is not the case. So I think that this is a very good example, because this is also an example of a doctor, of a medical doctor, who is a transgender man, who kind of functions within kind of the Enoch community in Canada, and treats patients who are transgender. So I think it's quite important for us to realize that actually this is not a new phenomena, and it's not actually something that is present just in a Western society. It is actually present across the globe. So we're talking about gender and we're talking about biological sex. Let's talk about kind of gender expression. How does that fit into the equation? Because I think a lot of the young persons would be experimenting with how they look. And I think, I don't know if you have that experience, but all of them kind of always push the boundaries of fashion. They push the boundaries of what's appropriate, inverted commas, simply because we live in a society that sometimes is very structured and very decisive about what's allowed and what's not allowed. So we know that there are people who express their gender in a kind of masculine way, and there are some people who express their gender in a very feminine way, and there are some people who are androgynous. An androgynous look is something that I'm sure you have seen. You kind of see a person and you're like, I really don't know kind of how to refer to you. And generally speaking, it is advisable, nevertheless, no matter how people's gender expressions are, to ask them about their gender pronoun and how they would like to be referred to. That's always seen as more polite than you having a guess. But gender expression wise, we kind of see this very well example of Conchita Wurst, who was a Eurovision winner from Austria. And I think if you see that kind of how difficult it is for people who were kind of giving scores and kind of trying to stay politically correct, but also like not necessarily rude, but also like didn't know how to behave, and they didn't know how to refer to Conchita Wurst. And she uses she, her gender pronouns when she's performing, but on a day-to-day basis, he identifies as a gay man. So it is just a performative form of expression, which is different to some persons whose expression might be more persistent. We have Billy Porter, who uses he, him gender pronouns and identifies himself as a gay man, but very much pushes what is appropriate for men in kind of modern culture and beliefs. And one of the quotes from Billy Porter is that clothes don't have gender. So I think there's something about how people choose to express themselves and who they follow. So I think it's quite important for us to remember. And then we have people like Grayson Perry, who dresses up with heterosexual men, married to a woman, have children, but uses kind of the fashion and kind of the gender expression in a very kind of artistic way to kind of showcase the fact that gender and what is appropriate is just a construct. So I think it's something for us to kind of think about, and when we are kind of talking about gender expression. And I'm saying this because it is quite useful for us to see where those terms live. So when the young persons tell us, oh, you know, someone is androgynous, we know kind of what they're talking about. When they say, oh, someone's genderqueer, I think it's quite important we know where those terms live. And last but not least is sexual orientation, so whom a person is attracted to. So we know about people like Ben Honti, who has been a BBC presenter and now works for Vice magazine, or Wanda Sykes, who has got amazing Netflix, that's your homework. Wanda Sykes, who have got amazing stand-up comedy on Netflix and talks about the ups and downs of same-sex relationship and having kids and being a mother. and it's quite interesting to kind of see her take on it, which is kind of very relatable on many levels, because children are children. And then obviously we know about historical figures, so like Publius Aurelius Trainius Hadrianus Augustus is a person, so Hadrian for short, is a ruler of Roman Empire, one of the 6 good emperors of Rome. And he's quite an interesting character because he has been in love with a man. And you could ask very fairly to kind of how can we know that someone is in love with a man since it has been so long ago in ancient times. And it's a right question, but actually there's so much evidence to show that he has been in same-sex relationship that it is beyond any reasonable doubt. So he has been in love with Antonius, whom he met in Greece. They traveled together, and Antonius sadly died in the Nile. He died in Egypt, having a swim in the Nile. There's some assumptions and some kind of historical guesses about him might have been murdered because the emperor had been, inverted commas, distracted by that interaction. So, and as we know, kind of the Roman Empire's ideas of kind of life and death have been quite played, more politically speaking. So he dies, and what Hadrian does is quite unusual, never happened before and never happened since. He pronounces his dead boyfriend, who was a common man, to be a god for everyone to worship, build a city in his name on the site of his death, and then connects that city with an ocean, with a road that he calls Via Hadria, which is Road Hadria, after himself. So I think it is quite interesting and very much poignant, and I don't think that there's any doubt about how he felt about Antonius. So I think it is quite important to recognize that sexual orientation is not something new. It hasn't been discovered yesterday. Maybe the words are, because we are kind of trying to name things, and we always discover how to interact with the world around us with meaning in a meaningful way. But sexual orientation has been present since the beginning of time. So I'm going to show you a short video now, which is quite important for us to, or not, as the case might be, because it doesn't seem to be working. Bear with me 2 seconds. I will make it work for you, don't worry.
Oh my God, are you
Oh, it's working now for some reason.
So when did you first realize you might be straight?
Back with you now. Okay, so let me just share with you another screen. Here you are.
Oh my God, are you straight? So when did you first realize you might be straight? How do you know that you're definitely straight if you've never even kissed someone of the same sex as you? So do your family and friends know you're straight? Do you think being straight might just be a phase? I mean, maybe in a year or 2 you might start to be attracted to people of the same sex as you. So do you have any other straight friends, or are you pretty much the only one in your group? Oh my God, I have a straight friend who lives in Edinburgh. Maybe you guys know each other. I know how you straight people like to hang out in the same circles. So, are you active in the straight community? Do you support straight rights? You know, do you think straight people should be able to have the same rights as a gay person? Do you think straight people should be allowed to get married and raise children? So are you a practicing heterosexual, or are you just slightly attracted to the opposite sex? Do you think straight people should be allowed to adopt children? I mean, what happens if they influence the sexuality of their kids? Are you straight? Did you ever experiment with someone of the opposite sex in college? So when did you first decide to come out of the closet about being straight? When you first realised that you were straight, was there a little awkward period in your life when you weren't quite sure whether you should tell your friends or not? Do you openly live a straight lifestyle? Are you straight? Are you straight? Oh my God, are you straight? That's disgusting.
So this is used specifically just to show how questions like this sound to an LGBT plus person.
Okay, so there's another meme going up.
Making sure that we don't ask questions that make people feel that way, because it's quite problematic. So what we try to do here is to make sure that we're creating an environment for young persons to ask us questions and be comfortable with us, and asking us questions and asking them questions that aren't helpful is not going to build a relationship that is conducive to that educational process. So I feel we need to be very mindful of what we are asking the young persons, and if there is a way for us to find out information in a different way, we shouldn't be doing it, you know, in a way that dismisses the young person's experience, basically. So that's something to take away from that video, and I think it's quite important for us to remember that the young persons are very happy to answer some questions, but we need to be very mindful of how we are utilizing that time of theirs and their attention. So sexual orientation is not something that can be changed. It has been proven in science over and over and over again that it's impossible to change sexual orientation. So we cannot stop gay people being gay, and we cannot make straight people gay, and that's not how it works. And that's quite clearly evidenced across the board. Is it natural? Sexual orientation has been present in a lot of species across the board. So we know that sex-same attracted animals, including lions, have been present since we started observing nature and noting the behaviors of animals around us. Now we have captive evidence as well as wildlife evidence. So we know that in zoos as well as in the wildlife, it happens with the same frequency as it does amongst humans. So it's about 7 to 10%. Of people are involved, well, in this case, animals, of the species are involved in same-sex relationships. And the question that I think we are asking ourselves all the time is like, what is the purpose of same-sex attracted relationships in the wild? Because I think the question that often arises, again, from the kind of medical model of thinking, is that, you know, if every species was same-sex attracted, then how they would reproduce and how they would survive and how they, you know, carry on being, essentially. And the answer is quite simple, actually. But it doesn't lie in biology. It lies in kind of anthropology and sociology. What they found was the same-sex attracted individuals are committing the whole energy and the whole effort towards the tribe. So it's actually an evolutionary advantage to have same-sex attracted individuals in the group. So that's A. And B, they are the only ones interested in adopting children. And that is something that has been noted in penguins and has been something even been observed amongst lions, is that same-sex attracted couple is more likely to look after a young that parents have been killed or poached or you know, in whatever other circumstances gone missing. They're more likely to look after them as if it was their own than the heterosexual couples. And it is because, naturally speaking, if we kind of go through the whole process of reproduction and survival, the species that are the heterosexual would look to reproduce their own genetical material. And obviously, if the child is from a different parent, they would have a different genetical material. So they are of no value in kind of the wild environment that it might be. So, but obviously a lot of the same-sex attracted couples, what they do have, they still have parental instincts, as it has been observed many, many times over and over. So it is quite interesting to see those kind of behaviors and this fostering kind of happening in the wild. There has been a Dr. Christian's documentary on Channel 4, which is very interesting. So Dr. Christian is a GP, and he has done an interesting piece of research into different methods that have been used in the past to cure same-sex attraction. And he decided to do a documentary and undergo every single of those treatments to see if he can stop being gay. Needless to say, he's still gay. He was dating one of my friends, so he's definitely still gay. So it's quite interesting to kind of see that none of those treatments work, and as I did mention, it's not possible to change people's sexual orientations, and this is just one of the examples. And what UK is now investigating and is going through the parliament is the legislation that is going to make any attempts at curing sexual orientation an illegal act. At the moment, it is a safeguarding concern. So any young person who is subject to any form of conversion treatment, which can be psychologically, although it's not psychologically approved, or even faith-based, is considered to be a safeguarding risk, only because we know for a fact that young persons who have undergone such treatments have got heightened risks of suicide. So we know that it has impact impact on the self-esteem, as we have mentioned before, which is critical for young persons to grow and develop. So that's kind of one of the things. Relationships and sex education appropriateness test. So we're going to do relationships and sex education appropriateness now. I think I have a theory, and it has been proven to me several times, that one of the biggest kind of like holdbacks for parents is to know what to say at what age and when is a good moment to start those conversations, because we hear all those things of, you know, children are being corrupted and all that kind of stuff, which is quite interesting. Fun fact is that the sex education and relationship education are both kind of started very, very early on in Netherlands, which got one of the lowest levels of teenage pregnancy in Europe, and is doing really well on kind of all the outcomes of on the kind of key performing indicators when it comes to children's health on that regard, versus kind of Britain, which, you know, when I first started working in this field 15 years ago, like the teenage pregnancy was like the topic number one, because it was through the roof here. So I think it is quite important that we realize that impact. So what I'm going to do now, so we're not going to be, this is going to be, and this is where we're participating. So there's going to be a participatory element to this. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to send you in a chat. Can everyone see the chat? Yeah, I'm sure you can. So I'm going to send you a survey. So I sent it in a chat. If you open a survey, so this is anonymous, completely anonymous, so we don't know who responded or who didn't, but please do, just for your own kind of guess, I suppose, or an assumption, or challenging your assumptions. Let's have a look at the relationship and sex education kind of responsibilities and appropriateness kind of questionnaire. So what you are going to see when you log in, you'll be able to see several things. You'll be able to see on the left-hand side all of the different elements of kind of, well, relationship and sex education, I suppose. And then there'll be ages. So what we're asking you to do is to slide to see which one of those should be at what age. So if you say the number one is, I don't know, making sure that the young person understands all of the intimate parts. Is this at age 4 to 6? Is it at the age of 11 to 12, or whatever the age brackets are? I can't remember on top of my head. But, and I can't see it because I'm looking at this presentation now. So have a look, respond to those. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do it, just because we will then kind of go back and see kind of what people thought, and do we all agree or do we all disagree? Is there some room for negotiation of like what happens when, or isn't there a room for negotiation of what happens when, or if are things kind of fixed? And then I'll tell you kind of how they kind of broadly fit together and what should happen first before other things happen. So I'll let you do the quiz. I can see my end kind of how many people have seen it. So I'll have a look. We'll play you some calm music while you do that. And I'll see you in a couple of minutes. So enjoy your quiz undertakings. May the odds be ever in your favor, as they say. Okay, so welcome back. I can see that a lot of you have done it. So interesting. I'm sure you are curious as much as I am to see how people have scored things. So, okay, let's have a look. So let me share it with you because it will show us where people are at. So let me just change this mode to this one. So just to kind of give you an indication of like where people are at. So what we can see here is what is the percentage of how people have voted, right? So you can see that understanding simple rules around personal safety, who to ask for help, resisting pressure when feeling uncomfortable, safe place to play and say no. 60% preschool children, 4 to 7, 8 to 11. So you see how different people perceive things. And I think that's exactly this is why I love this exercise. It kind of shows us how differently people think, right? So if I educate my child at this age and you educate yours at this age and they happen to get together, then they will have a completely different understanding of what's going on, right? So that's something that we have to think about. Second one, similar split, 20-40-40, slightly different. Here, set standards of behavior that are acceptable to partners, particularly in respect of domestic violence. 40-20-20-20. So just kind of giving indications, we're not going to discuss it here because I'll tell you exactly where those things fit, but just kind of give you an indication of how divided we are, right? So I think it's quite interesting. So there's not a single one where we all agreed, oh, this is a good one, 60%. So we all agreed 8 to 11, puberty-wise. That's a good one, majority of. Is there a one where you all agreed? Oh, this is the biggest one yet, 80%. 11 to 14. Be provided with a range of health information and local services, including contraceptive and sexual health services. Interesting. Majority of you have agreed to that one. Let's see if there is one where you all agreed. I think there was one. Here we are, 100%. Understand family relationships, e.g. gran is mommy, mum, preschool children. So it's 100% of you have agreed. Interesting. Anything else? Let me just have a look if there's any other 100% of agreed. Quite divided, aren't we, today, in our opinions of where we are. This is a good one. Talk about and name feelings and emotions, preschool. Fabulous, yeah, preschool. It's quite a lot to put on preschool. So under fools, that's kind of how they define it in this exercise, because we've got interesting. No further agreements, I'm sorry to tell you. We are quite divided, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing. That's why we're here. Remember, we're on the pyramid. It's just a very good thing to explore. Wonderful. So in that case, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to go back to my presentation so I can tell you all about stuff that we need to know. So let me just go to the presentation mode. To switch between screens, it's all very much. Here we are. So relationships and sex education appropriateness. So preschool children should be supported to understand private parts of the body in appropriate touching and modesty. It is quite important to mention here that children should be able to name parts, appropriately name parts, so those parts are, as soon as possible, simply because it causes a lot of safeguarding concerns. And I'll give you an example. There was an example of a child saying to the teacher, out of the blue, oh, my uncle sometimes licks my cookie. So the teacher kind of thought that it's weird, but it's not a safeguarding concern, and has spoken to the mother about that. And the mother have highlighted that they use a cookie as a word to describe very intimate parts, as the mother said, inverted commas. And immediately from just kind of a weird behavior of, maybe stealing cookies and, teacher saying, because the teacher reacted in that equation, oh, maybe he just was very, maybe he just likes it so much. Like that's just, when you kind of reference something else, it's quite easy to make a judgment and quite easy to make a wrong one. So it is quite important that we all use similar language, as it puts a risk at the child being misunderstood or misconstrued, and safeguarding concerns being raised further down the line, which can be problematic. So I think it is quite important that we understand that for 4 to 7-year-olds, they should be able to understand simple rules around personal safety, who to ask for help, resisting pressure when feeling uncomfortable, safe place to play, and say no. Again, we kind of mentioned saying no as a kind of assertive skill, so kind of building their self-esteem and saying no is quite important. And I'm going to say one more thing. I've done, so I'm that age that all my colleagues and all my friends from my childhood have children now. So I go back home and I visit them, and I play with the kids, and it's quite an interesting experience because I see the cultural differences. I'm from Poland, so I can see kind of cultural differences, kind of how people expect a child to be obedient, and just like and I think saying things like, oh, go and hug uncle, because they refer to me as uncle, and I'm like, well, no, like if they don't want to hug me, that's okay. And I think it's quite important that we allow children to not do things against their will, because the moment we start doing this, it kind of then pushes on into becoming a problem, right? So it's quite important that we start very, very early on and do not permit the child saying, when the child says no, that's a no, especially when it comes to their physical body and their contact. I think it's giving a choice. So, there's a difference between forcing a child to give a hug and a handshake or wave. So you can give a child a choice of like, oh, do you want to wave or do you want to hug? I think there's a difference. I would expect to at least be waved when I'm leaving the house, but I'm not expecting a hug from a child who doesn't want to give me a hug. And I think it's quite important that we differentiate those things, because then it translates across into them not being able to say no to people when it comes to sexual consent. So I think we need to guard children's ability to say no, and that no being sacred. I've played with one of the children who is very lively, and she climbs on people and she climbs on me, and we're playing in, and we were tickling each other and we were kind of chasing each other around the room. It's quite intense. But then at some point she said, oh, stop. And I immediately stopped, obviously, because I think that's quite important for a child to learn that. And she was like, oh, no, carry on. I'm like, well, you used magic word, and the magic word is stop. When you say stop, that means stop. So I think teaching child very early on that those words matter is quite important. And we kind of use the metaphor of it being a magic word, which I think is quite important. And we're kind of laughing about all the other magical words. So it's quite important for us to realize that happens quite early on. Now, the names of parts of the body, including agreed names of sexual parts, as I mentioned, talk about the name, feelings, and emotions, which I think is quite important and critical for child at that age. Understand the process of growing from young to old, including answering questions truthfully, but without sexual detail. And I think it's quite interesting, but sometimes the sexual detail at this age can be a sign of very early kind of exposure to inappropriate information at this stage. Remember that kind of we're thinking about appropriateness at this stage. Understand family relationships and kind of grand and mom, mom is mom. Talk about friendships and understand that they have control over their actions and bodies. I think actions is quite important, and we should make sure that we're connecting a child with that information. And also, identify and be able to talk to someone they trust, which I think is quite important as well for child at that age. So 8 to 11, I think I'm going to say this now because I think it's quite important and I believe it's poignant. 8 is a very interesting age in child's development. It is a time when they are not yet cynical. They are still recipient to a lot of information. They don't necessarily have a vast network of peers who are kind of feeding them a lot of wrong information, which happens in teenage years a lot. And at the same time, at the age of 8, it is considered to be an interesting time because it allows people to, it allows the child to connect really well with what you are saying, because they have this ability to self-reflect and understand what is being said. But something else is really important at that age. They do appreciate being treated like an adult. So they do like this kind of like, oh, we're going to now have like a serious conversation because now. So, I think that it's quite an interesting age. It's quite a poignant age. So a lot of this kind of conversations and literature is kind of advised that, those conversations, those poignant conversations that we'll be talking now should happen quite early on, because it's a very magical window that actually can, magical again, it can squeeze a lot of information in. Obviously appropriately and to the level, but at the same time just being mindful that that's the case. So understand how the body changes as they approach puberty and how to manage these changes. And by 11, they should ensure that they know about puberty for both sexes. I think it's quite critical. Where it is apparent that puberty will start early, guardians need to ensure children are informed and prepared, especially if it's like early onset puberty, which is a medical condition. Take appropriate risks, when to say no and when to seek help. Resist pressure from peers and adults to behave in risky or unacceptable ways, and be aware of different types of relationships, partnerships, marriage, friendships, and families. Form and express opinions and to listen to other people's point of view and belief is quite critical. And then 11 to 14, manage the physical and emotional challenges of puberty in a positive way. Be provided with information which includes the opportunity to talk about human reproduction, including periods, pregnancy, sexually acquired infections, and contraception, including where to access further advice and support. Resist pressure to have early or unwanted sex. Understand the meaning of confidentiality and its boundaries. Understand that good relationships can promote mental and emotional well-being. Have a clear understanding of the law relating to sexual behavior of young persons, and respect differences in relation to gender and sexuality. Understand what rights and responsibilities means in a relationship, and recognize the stages of emotions in relation to loss and change caused by divorce, separation, family breakup, and how to manage their feelings. So all of those things there's a lot for that age group, right? 11 to 14-year-olds, but we're kind of expecting that 11 to 14-year-olds have got a bit of a wider understanding of what's going on. I think one thing that I would kind of point out here, when we kind of look at kind of meaning of confidentiality and its boundaries and kind of what isn't confidential is quite important. And when we look at good relationships, we'll kind of look at the good relationships and patterns of things that can be risky or challenging things. So we'll look at this in a minute, just going to give you a bit more understanding into kind of how to present certain models to a young person at appropriate age. Bear with. So, oh, it's not working anymore for some reason. There's lack of cooperation from technology today. So one thing is that it is hoped that by the time young people grow up, they'll be able to consider their choices, behavior, and responsibilities in their sexual and personal relationships, have sufficient self-esteem to value themselves and others, understand the need for safer sex and practice this if sexually active, value their sexual orientation, communicate and negotiate effectively about sex and relationships, access information, advice, and support services appropriate to their age, needs, and sexual orientation in order that they enjoy good sexual health. Have the knowledge and ability to protect themselves and their sexual partners from unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections, recognize and avoid exploitative and harmful relationships. And I think those things are quite important because it gives us an indication of kind of where this young person should be at. So this is like a destination essentially, because one thing I'm going to say at this stage as well is the British law is a very interesting one when it comes to sexual consent, right? So that generally speaking, the rule at Mosaic is that we tell young persons the age of consent is 16. The legality of it is slightly different. And I think it's worth for us to know. Worth for us to recognize that the age of consent in UK is a bit more of a kind of gray spectrum than it is kind of cut off 16. So yes, I think we should still carry on telling young persons that it is 16 by any stretch of imagination, because we don't want them to feel pressurized into doing things they aren't supposed to be doing. However, there is some leniency within that. So generally speaking, the peer-to-peer relationships, which are under the age of 16, are not technically illegal. which is quite important for us to recognize, right? And it is important for us to kind of keep on the back of our mind. If they are peer-to-peer, right? If they are 15 and someone is 18, then obviously they are, frowned upon and generally speaking not seen as legal, simply because the 18-year-old should know better and age of consent is 16. But when we look at peer-to-peer relationships, I think a lot of the times, people will try things, and it would be problematic for the legislators, and that's what they agreed on, to prosecute or criminally prosecute two 15-year-olds who decide to have a relationship, or two 14-year-olds who decided to have a relationship and do something sexually. So that's why there's a spectrum. However, under the age of 13, and no matter what happens, the child cannot consent to sex under any circumstances. So any form of sexual activity for under the age of 13 is considered to be a criminal offense by statute. So it goes into its own span. So I think it is quite important for us to remember that it's under 13, absolute no. When it comes to 13 to 15, it's a bit of a gray area. Obviously, we don't want 13-year-olds or 14-year-olds to, get themselves prematurely involved in relationships of any sort. However, again, it would be quite difficult to kind of prosecute the 14-year-olds because they decided to experiment or whatever. So for that reason, I think it's quite important for us to realize that there is that kind of leniency within that spectrum and within that legislation. So. Let us look at consent. I think consent is really important. At Mosaic, we kind of utilize this methodology, which is quite useful to talk about consent, because it helps young persons to kind of realize what consent really is, right? I think very often people say, oh, consent this and consent that, but actually they don't understand what it means. So what we decided to do at Mosaic is we decided to kind of come up with, again, kind of a model for young persons to have a look at consent and how that model can be applicable, which you are very welcome to use should you decide to do so. So we say the consent stands for conscious, because you cannot consent if you're under influence of any sort. So if you are under influence of alcohol or drugs, you are not able to consent to sexual intercourse, right? And I think it is quite clear. Legislation is very, very clear about it. There has been many cases where that has been proven in court. So you cannot consent to sexual intercourse if you're under influence. So you have to be conscious, right? It must be obvious, right? So it is not something, oh, like, she didn't say no or he didn't say no, right? That's not enough, right? It has to be obvious. Consent is obvious. You say, yeah, let's do it. Like, both parties have to have this level of, the level of enthusiasm is the phrase that we use. So it is about now, not later or yesterday, right? And I think it's quite important because a lot of the young persons would use things like, oh, but you agreed to this last time we saw each other, right? Just because you agreed to something last time doesn't mean that you have to agree every single time, right? So consent is something you give now. It doesn't apply in the future, it doesn't apply in the past, it's just now, right? So just very present focused. It's specific, right? Which is very important because that also gets misconstrued a lot. So we say that within the consent, you give consent to have oral sex, for instance, right? Doesn't mean that you are going to consent to vaginal or anal sex, right? Which is quite important for us to recognize those differences. So specific means you are agreeing to that specific activity. So someone turning around and saying, well, you led me on because we have had oral sex, or you gave me a blowjob or whatever. Young persons more like use that language. And now I'm expecting you to have a full-on intercourse, right? So I think it is quite important that we recognize that you consent to specific things, right? If you consent to kissing, doesn't mean that you consent to penetration, right? Those are they are two different things. They require a separate consent. And I think it's quite important that we kind of start crystallizing it for the young persons. It is equal, which means that both parties have got equal say. It is not coerced and it is not nagging. You are not going to believe how many times in my career I have had young person say to me, oh, yeah, we had sex out because, he was asking me, repeatedly. And I was like, I just thought that it'll be easier to just do it. Right? So the kind of nagging and harassing that is a thing. So I think it is quite important that it has to be equal, right? Something that is quite useful to ask. It's like, okay, so if I ask someone to have sex once, is it okay? Yeah, if I ask twice, how about 3 times? 5 times? So it's kind of giving people indication of like what is harassment and what is this kind of like coercion. If I ask you for something 15 times, or however many times more than twice, perhaps, that is already kind of breaching that line. It's kind of me trying to wear you down. It's then non-equal. We say it's non-binding, right? So it doesn't mean that now because we have had sex, we are in a relationship. Now because we have had oral sex, we are now going to have a vaginal sex. Like that is not something that is binding, right? So we say it is non-binding. So that means that you have consented to those things because you were conscious, it was obvious, it was for now, it was very specific, it was equal, and it is non-binding, right? So it doesn't mean that you now have to agree to this every single time you see each other. It doesn't mean you have to agree to this with other people even, right? Because that's something that has also been used in kind of some of the stories that I have had. And it is true, right? It is true to you. It is true to your values. It is true to how you feel about that situation. It's not something that you feel pressured into, coerced into, harassed into, or whatever other methodologies being used to get you to do things that aren't true with you, and saying things like, oh, but I really love you, like all this stuff that that anyone who is working with young person, have ever spoken to a young person before, would have heard before. So it's something important that we make young persons alert that those things do occur and people do have ulterior motives. I'm being conscious of the time, so I'm going to move on. So what are the signs of abusive relationship? And I think we were talking about relationship and kind of how it fits within the age of appropriateness of education. And I think one thing that I'm going to tell you is the kind of methodology that we use, because I think we find that young persons do not have at all understanding of what abusive relationship kind of looks like, feels like, sounds like. And a lot of the times, I used to work in domestic violence myself as a counselor on a helpline. So I have a good insight into how people kind of conceptualize abusive relationship. And there was a research many years ago, because I have worked there many years ago, but there was a research at some point that said that people are in a relationship for 7 years before they realize it's abusive. 7 years. It's a very, very long time, considering that actually there are some very early signs. So a few things. This is quite an interesting one. It's quite an old model, but it's still very much used in domestic violence and domestic abuse sector. It's kind of Walker's model of abuse. I think one thing that happens is a pattern, right? So it's quite useful for us to know, because we can then utilize this to help our young persons to realize things. And I'll tell you how to do that in a second. So there's something about tension buildup, right? So there's this process of like things are getting wrong, and it can be, they feel annoyed, and things are going on, and like you can feel tension kind of building up. Then there's incidents of abuse. So it can be verbal, emotional, physical, and they're blaming it. It doesn't really matter. Then we have reconciliation. So there's an apology, like, oh, I'm really sorry, I didn't feel like this. This was silly of me, this will never happen again. And they have a period of calm. And then it repeats itself, right? So that's one thing to realize. Another thing to realize is that that circle becomes smaller with time. So what happens here is intensity of abuse increases with time, right? So there's few things that increase with time. It's not only the circle that becomes smaller, so it kind of becomes more frequent, those incidents and this tension. So there's finally a time where there's no kind of honeymoon, as it's very often referred to, period, or it becomes really tiny, and then it's just this tension, it's just constant tension. You're kind of walking on eggshells, you don't know what's going to happen first. What is quite important here, however, and this in this graph is quite useful to realize, is that nothing ever starts with a push or a punch, right? Everything starts very early on, and it starts with two huge indicators of abusive relationship, which kind of is going to become an abusive relationship. First, it's the put downs, right? So the abuser, it's quite important for us to realize that abuser doesn't do it consciously. It's a subconscious process. 75% of people who are the abusers have been abused in the past or have witnessed abuse as children. So it's not something that people kind of premeditate, but those are patterns that are psychologically present and we know exist. So what happens is that not all forms of abuse occur at once. So what first happens is tear down of your self-esteem, because I know that when you have low self-esteem, I can do whatever I like with you. So put downs, it's like saying, oh, stop being stupid, oh, you look so ugly, oh, why did you put so much weight, you're like whatever, right? Those are all things that kind of are put downs. Anything and everything that gets you down a notch. And it doesn't have to be huge at the beginning. It kind of starts as the death of 1,000 cats, right? So that's kind of beginnings. The moment you lose your self-esteem, then what happens is, or thereabouts, sometimes they overlap, is the second element, which is isolation. So what I'm going to do as an abuser is to make sure that you don't have network around you. So I don't want you to see your friends because they're stupid. Like if you see your friends, our relationship is over. Like I don't trust you to be with your friends. You're stupid friends, right? All of a sudden, or family even, which happens a lot, you'll be surprised. So what happens as a result is people get isolated. So there's two very big indicators that there's something going on. Then financial might happen, might not happen, depending on how adult people are and how much financial security they have, but kind of cutting people away from resources like finance and asking them to set up a joint bank account, and they will look after the money and all those kind of things. So it kind of basically aims to escalate into, so the physical violence is actually 5th, 6th in the row. So when people kind of like, oh yeah, but he doesn't beat me up, so that's not domestic abuse. Well, no, not yet. But then what we know is that, again, with time, intensity increases. So not only the circle shrinks, but also intensity of what is going on increases. So then when the physical violence starts, then normally it's quite dangerous. But the last one, which is considered to be the red flag in domestic violence, is the sexual violence. So any form of rape is considered to be towards the end of the violent cycle, and when that happens, then we know in practice that it does lead to people losing their life at the end. So it's quite important we observe those patterns early, right? So when we discuss it with young persons, we kind of don't talk to them like, oh, when you were in a relationship, again, kind of going back to our methodology of work, right? We say, well, you might observe it amongst your friends. So I just want you to be aware of the things, like when you see your friends and they get into relationships, and you sometimes see friends and they're in relationship and with people who are treating them badly, and they say things that are actually you would have not said to them. So nobody should say to people. So what does that tell you? So I think it is quite important that we start building that understanding that, like, oh, that's not acceptable behavior, and then recognizing that those put downs are the beginning of the pattern, right? Because then it gives them that insight. And what we need to accept as parents, and in my case, as people who work with young persons, is that we only see the tip of the iceberg, right? So very often what we see is very, very tiny bit of what's really going on. So we have to make sure that we are on the lookout, and we create opportunities for the young persons to connect with us at whatever way they can. And I'll tell you kind of what few tips on how to create space that is allowing young persons to kind of approach us and have those conversations in a second. However, there is one big thing that I always tell my mentoring team. No matter what young person tells you, no matter how shocking, horrific, illegal, abusive, coercing, no matter what they're telling you, you cannot look shocked. Because what happens is, if you do, then they feel like they are burdening you with it. So the one thing we say, like externally, you're like a swan, graceful and accepting everything they're telling you with, good intentions, actively listening and being there for them. While obviously underneath the water, you're paddling, thinking, okay, so all those things that need to happen in order to make sure they are safe, right? So all those things that need to be put in place in order to so that the risks are mitigated and those young persons are safe. So I think it's quite important for us to realize that, right? So when we do that, we can then encourage those conversations to happen, because you don't know what they're not telling us, right? So if you react panically, what they might not tell you is actually a bigger piece of the puzzle that they have decided not to tell you, because they just realize that you can't take it and you have in their mind overreacted. It might not be overreaction it might be appropriate reaction, because if they tell you some story that would shock even me perhaps, but although having worked at the domestic violence counseling, I don't know what would have to shock me. But I think it is quite important that we kind of keep that in mind and stay calm and stay cohesive and be reassuring and kind of encourage further conversation, because again, what we're being told is a piece of a bigger puzzle. There's always more. There's always more. And this is why I am going to encourage you not to jump to conclusions. When they start telling you things, don't come up, because I think it's also quite common that we come up with solutions of like, oh, you can do this or you can do that. Or just, even when you observe domestic violence, one of the most difficult things that we have to tell people, especially people who are the relatives of the victims of domestic violence, is the fact that there's a limit. There is a limit to what you can do. There's very, very much a limit of what you can do, right? And telling the person, just leave them, is not going to cut it. So it is far more important that you are there and that you are listening and you don't come up with solutions at this stage, right? So it can be quite important. If you do have any doubts, there are domestic violence helplines out there to call and have those conversations to kind of help mitigate risks. But at this stage, like, you cannot tell them just leave, because again, you only see what is available to you at that stage. So a huge part of young person's experience is kind of building the form of identity and kind of establishing who they are in a broader context. And they want to be liked. So there's a kind of correlation between kind of relationships and kind of what they get into and kind of their peer group. So we must understand that what we are being presented with is sometimes not the whole truth. It is what young persons have interpreted as being the truth. So it is quite important that we are alert to what they're telling us, and that we are kind of puzzling things together, and again, puzzling underneath, planning for things. So a few tips just before we end. Perfect timing. God, I've done so well. Spoken so much. So a few things. I think there's something about giving time and full attention. I think very often there's no, we kind of, in the way we work, is that there's opportunity for interaction, right? So we embed in our practice opportunities for interaction, right? So the way the service is structured is that we know at which point the young persons would have interaction with mentors, right? The young person doesn't feel like it is, because their mentors are just basically hanging around and playing board games with them and having conversations about all sorts of random stuff. But this is time for engagement, right? And it creates that level of connection with the young person. So having opportunities, the time that you're spending together is quite important. It is important that we actively listen, and sometimes it can be quite useful. I would say there's three different types of active listening. There's one that I really, really like, which I can share with you, which works really well with teenagers, I found over the years. It's an active listening through clean listening. So it is referred to as such, because what you're doing is you're not jumping into any conclusions, especially if they tell you something. So if the young person tells you, oh, I'm thinking of having sex with James, for instance, right? You'll be like, oh, sex with James. And what it does do, you repeat a part of the phrase that they said or a word they have said, and it encourages them. And it sounds weird, but like what it does do, and I have experimented with it and it works, what it does do is encourages them to expand, because they're like, oh, you just need clarification. So and they'll just expand and go on and go on and go on. So it's quite useful, because the young person will feel like you are very interested in what they're saying. That's how it feels when people do that. I would say moderate your eye contact, because the teenagers, generally speaking, hate eye contact with passion. So I would say avoid it to some extent. I would say allow for space, silence, but reassure. So kind of, I think very often we want to be so helpful that we overextend and kill the space for the young person to say something. The young person will struggle to contradict you. So don't jump to any conclusions. Don't assume anything. Like, oh, something wrong happened. Because it might not be wrong. It might be something positive they want to tell you, that they have had sex and they really enjoyed it, and they were going to be with James for the rest of their life. Like, I don't know, whatever. But like, so don't jump to conclusions that it's negative. Because it's very difficult for a young person to contradict an adult. But reassure them, say like, oh, I'm here for you. Like, feel free to tell me, and like give them time. Like, okay, do you wanna, I don't know, bake cookies together? We can talk, or like whatever. Like when you occupy them, it's always easier to have conversations. Never assume, always ask. Like, ask them what is going on. Don't assume that they are with opposite sex, because again, if you're like, oh, so do you have a girlfriend, right? If you're asked if you have a son, it's hugely problematic, because again, it shows them that you are not receptive, that you are quite close-minded, that you are not able to have those conversations. Reflect their posture. It always quite useful. It feels on subliminal level that people are connected with you. When talking about a problem or talking, just sit with them, right? And you'll be surprised. Whenever I talk to parents, they always gobsmacked when I mention this, because they like, one thing that is quite common is that majority of the very poignant conversations happens in the car or on a sofa in front of the television. And it's because we sit together. It's a psychological thing. Like when we sit with someone, we feel connected with them on a different level than if they sit opposite us. Because opposite is an adversary, but actually next to us. Like, think about language, like shoulder to shoulder, standing together, standing united. Like, it kind of lends itself to that level. Sometimes even walking is quite useful, because if you walk and you're next to each other, like, oh, how's life, blah, blah. It's easier than just than a conversation over the dinner table, for instance, which is sometimes misleading. Challenge abusive language. Like, if they use language that's abusive, of like, oh, this, I'll just give you an example of something that I have had. Oh, this slut, blah, 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 blah. Like, we have to challenge this language that is abusive, because then we don't want to be in a situation where the child ends up to be the abuser in the relationship, right? So it is quite important that language is a foundation for relationships. And I always say that language is like an operating system for your brain, right? So if language is incorrect and uses the kind of derogatory terminology, then it's hugely problematic. And can be quite important for us to challenge language and say, well, actually, do you mean someone who is just having a lot of sex? What's wrong with that? Kind of challenging the concept around shaming people. And watch out for suicide indicators. So when a young person says, I had enough, I'm done, those are the suicide indicators, but that's not part of this training. But it's something that I always highlight, because I think considering the lockdown and impact it had on mental health, I think there's a huge impact on relationships of the young persons that they formulate with their peers, as well as with persons that are close to them or intimate with them. One thing I would say, and a good tip that I can share with you, you don't have to be an expert in sex education, and you have to be expert on everything sexual and vaginal and anal and penis or whatever. If you are going to give birds and bees conversation with the young person, make sure it's inclusive, and it includes both interactions, same sex and opposite sex, because otherwise you are again not providing the young person with everything that what they need. If you find it awkward to talk about it, this is a good tip for you. A friend of mine who has got now grown up kids, but my age actually, but have done it many years ago. She decided to buy some books and put them in the bathroom, so that all her children could browse freely at their leisure, as it were, without kind of it being a bit awkward, or like, because it's in the living room, like they're not going to go into the living room and like pick up a book, are they? But when it's like in the bathroom and like, it's nobody there, it's a private time and private space, like nobody will know that they have flicked through it. So I think it's kind of giving us a lot of that kind of work and that kind of conversation, which is quite useful to kind of start those conversations. And she was like, I've noticed the books moved, so they are definitely using that opportunity. So I want to thank you. That's all we have time for, unfortunately. I know there's hundreds of other, millions of other things that we could discuss. I'm happy to answer any questions, should you have any. But before you're going to do that, I want to launch a poll, because I've been told that I have to. So I hope you can answer me some questions, please. This is the webinar evaluation. If you could possibly answer those 2 questions, that would be very much useful. I hope you've enjoyed the time with me. This is unfortunately just a taster, because it's only an hour and a half. And people do PhDs in this department. So, you know, it is a huge conversation, but I'm hoping you found it useful and practical and interesting. And again, you know, if there's any questions or thoughts or feelings or emotions, do feel free to raise your hands and ask a question, or you can use a Q&A. And I was told that within a Q&A, you also have opportunity to ask questions anonymously, should you decide to do that. But you're very welcome to that. I'm pleased to see the results. But nevertheless, is there anything that you would like to ask? I'm going to open quiz questions and answers section. So if there's anything that you wanted to ask, please do fire away.
I just wanted to say thank you. I really, really enjoyed the session. You got through so much in an hour and a half.
Well, I know, it's like, what do you choose to say in an hour and a half? Oh my God, my voice is giving
Can't
up.
prioritize.
I know, it's very, very difficult, because you have to start the ground, and I don't really know you. And I think one of the problems is that I also can't engage with you, because it's supposed to be, you know, confidential space for everyone to join in, and we wanted it to be safe. So I think it's quite difficult, because I can't engage. So I don't know, because, you know, it can go in either way, like when we have engagement, but webinar is slightly different. But I'm glad to see there's no questions. Everyone is just, you know, they're now wizards of relationship and sex education.
And we'll make the recording available to everyone, just so you know, in case you want to like refresh yourself on any bits later. Brukash, can we share the slides, or are we not allowed to share the slides?
No, of course you can. Of course you can.
Oh, great.
I'll make it into a PDF, so that it's easier to browse through, and kind of add some notes, so that everyone has got access to it. And in your leisure, you can refresh yourself if you don't want to hear my voice again, listening to the recording. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, everyone. Okay, that's 6 minutes past. I wanted to say 6 minutes past 8:30, but I think it's just ridiculous. It's 36 minutes past 8. So since there's no other questions, thank you ever so much for coming, and I am looking forward to come across you at some point again. Sure. Oh yeah, Becky, that's fine. We'll hopefully be doing some professionals training as well, Becky, so then more of your team can come along. You can recommend it to them. Yes, come along. We love to have people. Just not that we kind of forced you to say that, did we? We're just like, you must tell your friends, you know, part of this equation, as it were. But it has been lovely to have you, Becky. Sorry, it's been a bit webinary, and you know, not maybe that's engaging. But I think the survey kind of came out to be quite good. Full free will. Yes, you do. We like to hear that. Wonderful. Thank you ever so much. Shall I close the webinar? Shall I wait for everyone? I don't know the best way to manage it. But you can stop recording, I think. Yeah, I'll stop recording.